something.
I can totally hear you. You have you've not become inaudible at any point.
Okay, cool. We had a little bit of a drop off, and if it happens again, I'm not sure what we're going to do. You and I might have to just record this as a video. If it happens again, this is one of the things we were discussing before we got started with the live video. Is we live in some kind of like low key remote places that, and that's amazing. You get a mountain, I get a weird valley. It does mean the internet isn't what we were used to in either London or Los Angeles, right? And that just comes with it.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Well, hopefully James will jump through that door if we lose the video again. But I think from the messages, we should be all right to keep going. Cool. All right. So that's the emergency procedures and the fundraising. So now on with the show. H1 2020, as we usually do, before we begin with the next year or the next half of the year, I feel like we should look back over a fairly exciting, both, I guess, personally and professionally, 2019, the whole year, and also, in particular, the second half. But, I mean, I don't know if you've had time, you would have had time to sort of pause and think, how did we go? How did we do with predictions? How is 2019 for you, and what were kind of like the configurations of the year, you think?
I'm sorry. Could you say that again?
Sure.
I was briefly distracted.
Briefly distracted.
There was a yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So we need to do a review of 2019. So how do you think?
Absolutely.
How do you think it went in terms of predictions? And I mean, let's just talk about that and some of the configurations that turned out to be significant.
Yeah. I've been, although I generally have too much to do, and that's probably at least half my fault, I have been spending the majority of my time for the last couple of weeks just thinking about 2020, which means thinking about how it's different than 2019 and every other year, and how it's the same. And so in terms of reviewing 2019, I am happy. I think the shape of it was very much as expected. We had the really gnarly Saturn South Node Pluto configuration, digging up a lot of problems. We talked about it in a couple terms, one of them being ancestral issues, and I just saw that everywhere. But then we had really kind of pleasantly, usefully disconnected from that. We had the Jupiter in Sagittarius all year. And so there were a lot of big wins. And it was interesting because there was, just talking to people, doing readings, observing. There's a lot of good and a lot of bad, and they were kind of separate in a way that where one didn't interfere with the other or cancel the other. It was just sort of like, well, there's the good over there, and then there's the difficult here. And so, yeah, that I see that in all of the lives I've looked at. One of the things in particular I was looking at just the other day was thinking about Uranus in Taurus, right? 2019 was the first full year that we had Uranus in Taurus. Mm-hmm. And that's an important piece of the puzzle to get a beat on, because that we're going to have that until 2025, right? That's going to be a constant moving forward through the first half of the next decade. And, we talked about it in terms of, it's Taurus, which has to do with, basic things, right? Foodstuffs, crops. There's something very, very rural in a good way about Taurus, and Uranus is extremely disruptive, both in a good technological sense, but also in a the rains came, so half your crops died sense. Yeah. And all the reports of the basically unexpected volatility in the prices of various foodstuffs because of farming conditions. Were just, like it's not what I want to see for the people affected by that. But in terms of like, what you want to see it as an astrologer, it's like, well, that's dead on. And the unhappy massive acceleration in bankruptcies in small farms in the United States is part of that.
Yeah,
Anyway,
agreed.
so those are some things that have been on my mind.
I was thinking about exactly that motif or that impact, in particular U.S. farmers, small to medium sized, but just in general, that 2019 had an historically bad harvest for everything. And what's fascinating to me looking at the sort of inflation numbers is that it hasn't necessarily flowed through yet. But for instance, according to Armstrong's model, inflation gets its uptick from January 2020, right? So I think if we look at 2019 in the context of
That makes
2020,
sense.
it is a continuation, but it's a tonal shift because the Jupiter Sag stuff, which I think is the configuration of the match, if you will, for 2019, is now no longer in play. So it's almost like we deal with the inertia or the consequences of it moving forward. But like staying with 2019, one of the notes I made in preparation for this video was thinking back on the meat grinder, because you and I had some long chats about it, given where it was going to land in my life. And I was going to be
Hmm.
traveling. I was coming back from the jungle, all the rest of it. And I'm like, this isn't a great time to be. I couldn't do anything about it, but I said, it isn't a great time to be traveling. And you said, to be honest, most of the meat grinder stuff is internal, at least for me, but also I know from a lot of people's lives that they are expecting, I don't know, rains of fire. But in the meantime, they were going through some fairly intense feels. And that was certainly the meat grinder for me. That was a kind of culmination of some deep, intense feels. But I'm just trying to think of other space weather events from 2019 that are worth commenting on, and that seems like one for me. I don't know. Like in retrospect, what do you? How do you think everyone did? Were people overly scared of the meat grinder, or do you think it landed as you expected it to? What do you reckon?
Yeah, it did land as I expected it to. It hits everyone's chart differently, and some really intensely, and some not so intensely. For you, that was in your ninth house of long distance travel, right? So, and near personal planets, and so it involved literal long distance travel, and grinding up a bunch of stuff internally and getting rid of it. And there's also something to be said for whether you are working with if you're sailing into the wind or using it to power you along. But yeah, there were deaths, there were fingers that were cut off that I know of. But it really, just because there's when we're looking at a configuration which is just in the sky, and we can say, oh, it has this character, that means statistically we see an uptick in this kind of thing and this kind of thing and this kind of thing, and that's part of the environment, and that you may or may not be participating in the news headline. I remember, so I did a number of readings where people, someone's like, oh, people who are knowledgeable about astrology, and they're like, oh, the meat grinder hits my chart here. What do you think? What does this mean? Should I be worried about this? What is the best practice for coming into this period? And I remember in particular, there's one client who had it in a particular area, and they were like, this is, I know enough about astrology to know that this isn't going to totally miss me. And I took a look at it in the context of things, and I said, I think there's going to be some pretty horrible stuff around you, but I don't think it's going to touch you or your family, but you're probably going to end up, going to need emotional support. You will probably be upset by this period of time. And so what happened was I did a follow-up with them, and they had, so at work died suddenly. And so that was really upsetting, and it was upsetting for everybody at the office, but it wasn't this person. And so, I think I think that's a really good example of, how should we say, this is a gnarly, when you say, oh, this is a gnarly period of time, understanding your proximity to it, because I think that's a really good example of sort of the gray area or the middle ground of proximity, where it's not that, it's not you, and it's not that it's not like your partner gets thrown into a wood chipper, but it's also not just a vague news headline,
Yeah.
and that's sort of like, it's in your world, but it's not happening directly to you, is probably more common than it's nailing you directly, or it's just some vague internet news story.
Well, that's definitely, there's a wider observation there. One of the things that I find frustrating, and again, like, I actually low key love the shit posting that is Astro Twitter, right? But there are some takes of varying degrees of hotness when you see particular configurations, and they don't all have to show up in your life. If you drop a pen on the ground during a
Yeah.
lecture, that's probably not the planets, right? And I think there's a really good uh, there's medicine in thinking about what's happening in the world, what's happening in my life, where do they connect, where do they don't, where do they not, rather, and I feel like the meat grinder was quite a good one for that.
Yeah, because it was really, as far as like a window where you had pretty much as much difficulty as possible, augured by a transiting configuration, right? To see what just like a gnarly ass month looks like, but you've got your own trajectory, destiny, karma, fate. You've got your own thing, that will intersect or move through that, and may participate, or may be insulated. When for people who are interested in how you make predictions or set expectations for an individual with astrology, your connection to where the planets are now, which is transits, are one layer, but they're in most traditional systems, they're not the primary layer. They matter, but they're not the one thing. And so if you're making thoughtful and responsible predictions, or setting setting expectations for a specific period, you look at what's happening where it hits their chart, but then you also look at the other timing systems. And the other timing systems, of which there are many, have an internal logic where it's the unfolding of your chart over time according to its logic. We can parallel it to, for example, the process of growing up and then going through puberty, that a human body does, right? It's like, around this age you have this encoded possibility, which it's now time for that to bloom. And so that's an internal clock, right? If you're being starved, let's say when you're doing the developmental stage of 4 to 5, that'll impact that developmental stage, but your body, the body and mind are still trying to do the development appropriate to that stage, right? And so we can look at, whether things were going super well for you when you were 5, or whether, there was a famine, but your being has still got its own pattern or track. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. The puberty and the impacts on human development is a very germane thing to say for where we went, for the sort of post H1 discussion we're going to have. So thank you for bringing that up. I'll be sure to do the same. For people, I didn't realize I can actually see people's comments coming up as it's going along, which is amazing. But to answer your question in the chat about how you pose questions, just drop them in the chat. You have to impress or intrigue Caitlin, and to a lesser extent James, and we will get the questions at the end of our H1 discussion. So any questions you have, drop them in the chat. The good ones get put in a document, and we do that on the end. And some of them are coming through now. That's really cool. But so we've done Meat Grinder, we've done Uranus and Taurus. Staying with 2019, I do want to talk about Jupiter in Sag because that's a nice way to talk about the tonal shift, or a way to talk about the tonal shift between 2019 and 2020. But in particular, the second half
I
of,
think it's crucial.
yeah, in particular for 2019, second half of the year, is there anything else that we need to, or even the eclipses last year, given that we've got more looming. Is there anything else from 2019 that we need to talk about from a debrief perspective and a context perspective before we do 2020?
I think the Jupiter piece is probably the most key. One, I will say two things quickly, and those two things are Neptune and Pluto. And Neptune and Pluto are going to be doing pretty much exactly the same shit in 2020 that they were doing in 2019. What's interesting is we're right now we've got Uranus and Taurus, Neptune and Pluto and Capricorn, and those just hold basically until we get to the middle of the next decade. And so, Uranus and Taurus was a new addition in 2018, right? One effect being volatility of commodity prices, food prices affecting farmers. It also has currency implications that we can get to later. Neptune in Pisces is the weirding. That is the it's that Neptune Pisces has that ability to dissolve reality constructs. It's part of the reason everybody's gotten excited about witchcraft and astrology, and everyone's been drinking the rune soup. The weirding continues, and then Pluto and Capricorn is just the scary. It's the shadow of the empire that never died, also consistent up to 2020 or 2025. So those are all the same. The big difference between 2019 and 2020 is Jupiter.
Yeah, and before we talk about that, that was a really good point to mention, which is it's not even like the plus side; it just is what it is. But we have increasing visibility over the next medium term. Something we spoke about in Portland, right, this year. Speaking of things that happened in H2 2019, we have increasing visibility because the slow moving planets are where they're going to be for the next few years. So the good side of that is we can see further through the fog on some things, right? And that's that's part of the same kind of macro story of the changing triplicities and things that we discuss each time, I think. But the plus side is a lot of stuff. Well, some of the outer things are going to look the same between 2019 and 2020, but that's because they're actually, as you say, in play for the next 4 or 5 years from a narrative perspective, with the exception, the key one. I'm seeing people talk about Jupiter in Sag and their impressions of it this year. For me, my impression of it was as a guy with a golden shield who's now no longer there. Or if you've watched that weirdly sexist animation on Twitter over the last week or so of the clown throwing knives at the guy's back, and he has his wife and she hugs him and he gets his magic bubble. That bubble is gone. So the sort of
I have not seen that. It's when you describe it verbally, it sounds extraordinary.
Yeah. You don't spend as much time on Twitter as I do, and that is to your credit. But yeah, so for me, my impression, the big part of the tonal shift between the end of 2019 and the beginning of 2020. Correct me when I'm wrong. Is the main point is Jupiter changing out of Sag and what that means. So now is the time, end of H2, beginning of H1, to kind of perspectivize that for people, I think.
Yeah, it's a big one. Jupiter's doing, even though Jupiter is much more swift than the other bodies we were just talking about. It's basically a year per sign. Jupiter's really in a position to kick off a variety of longer term changes or hold them back. And so from a sort of simple but solid technical perspective, Jupiter is very strong in Sagittarius, and Jupiter has a really hard time in Capricorn, right? And so Jupiter is what Jupiter provides, generally speaking, is a little luck, a little slack from the universe. It can provide opportunities to learn something new, opportunities to make something good happen. It's a little wind at your back in that particular area. And Jupiter in Sag was great at that, right? Now, in Capricorn, and that doesn't mean that everybody wins at everything when Jupiter's in Sagittarius, right?
Yep.
It might be that win is kind of off in the corner of your life, and you're like, yeah, well, that did go well. That's not nearly as important to me as these other things, but I can't shit on that, right? Or that Jupiter might have been in a really prominent place, and you might have had, best year ever in that area. Jupiter doesn't get to rule the entire year. But as far as what Jupiter does, Jupiter's now in Capricorn. Jupiter has a very difficult time in Capricorn, which on a simple level just means that not only has the location of that protection and luck moved, it's also that bubble is a lot weaker. Than it was. It's not just a location shift from Sagittarius to Capricorn, it's also a dimming of that. And it doesn't mean it's good for nothing, but it necessitates reevaluation of expectations. And if you're looking to get something from Jupiter, you need to think differently. Another big part of that is Jupiter went from basically being on its own and relatively unharassed in Sagittarius to joining Capricorn, right? Yeah. Saturn's in Capricorn, Pluto's in Capricorn, that's Tail of the Dragon's in Capricorn, right?
Yeah. So it's got to climb through a unpleasant menage a trois as well as being I like that it's not good for nothing, it's just that Jupiter in Sag was good for everything. So that's kind of like one of the ways.
Yeah, it kind of was.
Yeah. So yeah, and I've noticed
in terms of go ahead.
No, you go.
I was just going to say, in terms of being a working astrologer, for everybody who did elections for people, like picking great times, or on the astrological magic side, which you're picking great times. It was so nice to have Jupiter in Sag. You could always rely on good old Jupiter in Sag, and now that's off the board, which on a very simple level makes it much harder it's a much harder call to figure out what's the best time to do X, Y, or Z.
So, I mean, maybe that's a discussion we have now. What do we put it this way? There are going to be fewer kind of classic planets and houses or planets and signs elections in 2020 than there was in 2019. But that's, I guess, an opportunity or an invitation to be more strategic and kind of look wider or further out in the system to fix stars and decans and so on.
Yeah, it's so Jupiter in Sag does a lot. It's in a sense it's so supportive and protective that it lets people get away with being sloppy. And just quick example, the last shift from Jupiter in Sag to Jupiter in Capricorn was 2007 to 2008, right? So you had a market that was being kept alive and supported and protected, right? Then Capricorn's like, no, fuck that. I'm not protecting that. And then, we had what happened. And that's true. That's also true on a micro level, right? And so it's not that everybody and everything fell apart in 2008, but if you were a bank that was squeezing and stretching numbers, that came out. And so, there's less slack with Jupiter and Capricorn. And so I would say, on one level, it's not only, it's a very strongly worded invitation to get good, right? You know, because the success will be more down to skill and excellence rather than just have it riding, you know, spreading your eagle wings and riding that thermal.
Yeah, I didn't realize the 2007 2008 thing was in play. That's really interesting because one of the metaphors we were discussing last night is like government bailouts or share buybacks. So, in a situation where there's lots of essentially free money, you can keep share prices elevated because you get free money and you buy back your own shares. So, you kind of have these artificial inflated valuations of companies. And when that money switches off, there are no bids for these stocks and they come down. So the kind of Jupiter Sag is a market that has free money sloshing around. And Jupiter Capricorn is accurate price discovery, I guess is a nice way of saying things are going to be,
Yeah.
things are going to, things are going to shrink or decrease to a real value.
I really like the term, if you know, if we interpret it in a semi-poetic sense, I really liked accurate price discovery as a concept for Jupiter and Capricorn. Like,
well,
and that has to do, you know, just thinking briefly, like on just being a human, right? Like, there's all the stuff you can do, but then everything, you know, everything costs time, costs money, costs energy. Like, what is the, you know, there's, you know, once we get outside the do all the things paradigm, like, what is the cost of doing this? Well, one of the costs of doing this is not doing that.
Yeah.
Right. And there's an economy that in an economy of action and energy and of course dollars that I think Jupiter and Capricorn brings to the forefront. So as I was saying, you know, it's not just Jupiter in Capricorn, although these themes are all pretty Jupiter and Capricorn. It's Jupiter coming to what is essentially the most difficult place in the sky right now. Capricorn has the most on its plate, right? It's where the problems, the challenges, the difficulties are. And so you're bringing the, you know, even if Jupiter was super powerful, right, there's just too much to protect and fix. And Jupiter's not super powerful in Capricorn, right? And so, you know, it's sort of like if you have this, you know, greater benefic power like Jupiter to just magically make things better, protect them, but it's limited, it's finite, then, and there are more problems than you can just, you know, I don't know, fix it on, right? You have to start, even if you have that magic caulk, right? You're CAULK. You still, you got to make choices, right?
Yeah. I think
just like, you know.
I love that. And I know, and I get it because I'm a utopianist. I'm the first one to stump for optimism because I think optimism is a spell. But I've been sitting with how I want to approach or think with Jupiter and Capricorn. And for me, it's Jupiter is teacher. It's an invitation you effectively can't refuse, but right now it's an invitation to learn effective price discovery or economy. Because the two things we're talking about are Jupiter and Capricorn, but they're also Jupiter and big Capricorn energy anyway. In fact, it was this year, I remember Kelly had the best possible point about this when early in the year there was that semi-fake news story about the share house that didn't want a new flatmate that was Capricorn. And Kelly made the point that Capricorns actually make really good flatmates because they're the ones who handle the bills.
True.
and make sure that everyone's rent gets paid on time and so on. And that's big Capricorn energy, right? That's price discovery. And Jupiter moving from his Oprah phase is kind of like your is a financial consultant with your best interests at heart, but will pull no punches.
Yeah, and it's and you know, it's worth dwelling on Jupiter and Capricorn like this because we've got that until the end of December 2020. Right? It's in effect all year, and some of the pieces change around her, but that's just there. And so, yeah, and I wrote a piece that I'm pretty proud of about Jupiter and Capricorn, where I offer two different teachers that I think have Jupiter and Capricorn lessons. One of them being the Solomon of the Grimoires,
Mm-hmm.
the legendary Solomon, who whose task was to figure out how to get the devils in marching order so they would build the temple, right? Where obviously that's not the ideal workforce, right? But that's what that was the task. And then the other being an animal teacher. I chose the vulture, right? Who sees the opportunity in things falling apart. And is thoroughly anti-fragile from a Nassim Taleb point of view.
Yeah, it's funny. We had a chat about it after the premium members voted for the Q1 course for next year to be wealth magic, and so essentially the group waited until Jupiter moves into Capricorn before going for a wealth magic course. And I've been thinking about it since then because I made a joke when I announced it, that everyone waited, so it's slightly harder, but it has to be that way. The and
It's better this way.
it's the vulture medicine of how of seizing the available opportunities that are on the board. Like the Solomon story is amongst many things turning the non-physical physical. So using demon energy to
Mm-hmm.
end up with a temple. So it's the things that are on the board. And that's vulture wisdom, is finding the best of what is available. And that's not even,
Right.
and that might actually sound glass half empty, but I actually see that as glass half full. I think the vulture is more optimistic than maybe people realize. And so it's funny, like Capricorn, Jupiter
Yeah.
and Capricorn, one of the configurations that I thought was interesting for 2019 was, for a bunch of reasons, we had an extended Pisces season because we had that unusual retrograde and so on. So there was a lot more Pisces than just the sun's time in Pisces. And it seems to me that we've also
Mm-hmm.
got like a fairly persistent, over a couple of years, Capricorn season. So there's what we're about to talk about, which is the actual Capricorn season, right? But a way I've been thinking with it is like, are these seasons extended because they have particular things in them? And Jupiter in particular is one of them. Like a 2019 mood is it did kind of have an extended Sag season because you could pursue, if you had the
Mm-hmm.
bravery to move forward towards things that you want, you got quite a bit of luck behind your back. And it's sort of like, well, maybe we have an extended Capricorn season so that the Capricorn wisdom or medicine is available for longer, through 2020. And the kick in the tail of that, I guess, is if you don't avail yourself of said medicine, you do in fact get the kick, right? Does that make sense? Do you know what I mean? Like we can kind of look at extended seasons almost.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I think that's a good way to think about it. It's worth noting that Capricorn will be loaded with planets pretty much all year.
Mm.
Saturn does jump in to Aquarius for a couple months in the second quarter, and then is back in Capricorn all year, and we'll get to that. There's a little bit of a like, this is the next thing, but even when Saturn jumps ahead, we've still got minimum two planets in Capricorn, Jupiter being one of them.
I I like when they do that because we had a similar thing with Uranus and Taurus, right? And one of the things that is
Mm-hmm.
I'm so bullish about astrology in general in the 21st century is that there are now thousands of people doing what the first astrologers did, which is accumulate data of things that happen when there are certain configurations in the sky. So it's good. The optimism of, we should talk about actually Saturn and, well, no, we'll do January first, but it's almost like you get a peak. So
Yeah.
once Saturn tips into Aquarius, pay attention, um, see what happens with that, and then it'll tip back into Capricorn, and so you kind of know you have the invitation or the opportunity to prepare for when he actually does end up in Aquarius, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Cool. All right. So, well, seeing as we're talking about Capricorn, let's do H1. Let's do January. Well, actually, no. Let's do like a couple minutes on the year in general, because that was really useful for 2019, so
Yeah.
that we have a sense of where the peaks and troughs are.
All right. So let's see. Couple of things. One of the things that really okay. So let me. All right. So let's do like a quick cartography. One really important thing is Saturn, right? And so Saturn is in Capricorn, like it's been since the very beginning. Like it's basically been for the last 2 years, except for Q2. Second quarter is almost exactly all Saturn Aquarius, and so that's a preview of the Saturn of 2021, of 2022, and a little bit of 2023, right? That's the speed of that hand of the clock. So we've got that. We also have this year has has a pretty unusual number of for an unusually large portion of the year, we have Mars and Saturn angular to each other, right? Which means that they're either in the same place or 90 degrees or 180, right? Angular configurations are very action producing. They're very hard to ignore. They can be very frictive. And so for basically about 9 of the 12 months of 2020, we have Mars, Saturn angular to each other. And so that's that as far as like as far as the good and bad of good and bad days or good and bad months, that's rough.
Yes, it is.
And there's kind of no way around that.
When we do this in a year's time, we've just been talking about the kind of key configuration for 2019. It's going to be Mars's story in 2020 by the looks of things. Like everything else moves around, but it's a Martian year by the looks of things.
Yeah, and it's a Mars grinding against Saturn.
Yeah.
Right. Saturn is like, well, Saturn is the cold, slow difficulty, and Mars is the hot and fast, right? And so when you're like on an emotional level, we'd say, oh, Mars is like being kind of depressed and bummed out, and then, or excuse me, Saturn is being kind of depressed or bummed out. But then when you add, conflict or being angry on top of that, which is what Mars can bring in terms of emotionally, suddenly you've got kind of a shit show, right? You're like, well, I could deal with just being mad or just being kind of bummed out, but at the same time, it's, it can be too much.
Sure.
It's the double malefic thing, which doesn't mean and just to be clear, it's not the only thing Mars and Saturn do, but they do that.
Yes.
Now, we also have the eclipse cycle changes about halfway through the year, but we won't really be feeling that until the fourth quarter. We've got, eclipses are going to be for the first part in Cancer and Capricorn, just like they've been. We're going to get a full pair to begin the year. We get a solar in Capricorn on the 25th or the 26th of December, depending on your location in the globe. And then the
birth of the Antichrist.
Yeah, exactly. And then we get a lunar eclipse in Cancer about 2 weeks later, and then over the summer we actually have an annular, really intense solar eclipse in Cancer right next to the solstice, really close to the solstice. And then we have a really wimpy, like probably not visible to the naked eye, lunar eclipse in Gemini, which precedes it, and then another really wimpy lunar in Capricorn that follows it. But really, the main thing is that annular right on the solstice, and then six-ish months later, when we get to the end of Q4, it'll be all Gemini and Sagittarius for the eclipses for the next while. And so the nodes move into Gemini and Sagittarius in May, but we don't really see that writ bold, plain, and clear until the end of the year.
Gotcha.
We've got a lot of Cancer Capricorn stuff to finish up.
And I'm Lobster Sun and you're Lobster Rising, so it ends with an exciting bang for us.
Oh, it ends with the lack of a bang.
Yeah,
it ends with less stress on that axis. One thing.
Yay.
One thing that's really important and really easy to overlook when you're thinking about, where the planets are and what they do, is when a planet moves, look as much like there's looking for, what's the new thing, but look at what it's not doing anymore. One of the things I'd noticed about Jupiter moving into Capricorn is it moved into a social place for me, my 7th house. And so there were immediately good connections with people. And I was like, I've admired your work for a while. We've never talked before. That happened to three or four people. However, it was in a protecting physical, financial things place for me in Sag. And so I think it was within a day or two of the ingress, they're like, there's this problem with your well and it's going to cost a bunch of money. And I was like, that protection is gone. And now I get this instead. Right.
Yeah. I remember you telling me that one. That's classic. Anyway, so that's Mars. We've done Saturn. We've obviously done Jupiter. In terms of the shape of the year, if we're just in the eclipses, anything else we need to say just at a really high level before we do the first half? Yep.
Yeah, two more things for year shape. So second quarter is get to know Saturn and Aquarius, also Venus retrograde in Gemini.
Yeah.
Right? So the Venus retrograde story is a big part of that. And then the entire second half of the year, Mars is in Aries. It's retrograde for 2 months of that, but it's literally just Mars in Aries for, over 6 months. It moves in at the very end of June and doesn't move out till early January 2021.
He is the man of the match for 2020. And that's there is a distinct tonal shift. There's no kind of getting around. 2020 is going to be a more challenging year than 2019, and we have some discussions that I think are remediative, which we'll get to on this video once we talk about H1. But I think we will look at whatever's left of the world. It's not that bad, but I'm just being hyperbolic. Whatever's left of the world after Mars gets to do whatever it wants in 2020, particularly in the second half, and go, okay, it was definitely a Mars year.
Yeah. It's so this year's been more challenging to talk about than other years, because just on a simple technical astrology level, it looks worse.
Yeah.
Right. But but it's not the end of the world, and it's followed by other years, and this and that. And it's a challenge because as an astrologer or as a human being, I want to be honest about what I see, but it's not useful to inspire freakouts or panic. And you know what I mean? There's a balance there. Because if you look back at your life, there are some bad years. If you look at the history of any nation, civilization, whatever, there's that was the worst year for a while. It's a part of the story. It doesn't mean that you have to love it, but it's also not it's not worth going into full adrenalized freeze panic mode. And it doesn't mean that there are no moves, right?
Yeah.
It just means that the ambiance is shittier.
And it is, and one of the things that you can do, one of the things that makes it worse is to go into freak out mode, right? And that's the background anxiety and the stressing of your amygdala makes it worse. But I've been thinking about that tonal shift and the kind of Capricorn lesson of it all, and 2020 is the year we make our own light, or we are each other's light. In the way that 2019 was different, where you kind of had light slushing around the universe, you had some luck on your side, but the kind of
Hmm.
bringing it into the reality of other people and helping other people is we are required to be each other's light, and that is the sort of way I'm looking at it at the moment. There's less of the good stuff up there. That doesn't mean there's no good stuff. That means, guess what? You have to be the good stuff.
Yeah, I entirely agree. And that's, I'm working on writing up my thoughts and overview of 2020, and that's like one of the longer sections that I spontaneously got into the other day. It's like, okay, well, what do we do? And a big part of it, to kind of follow up on the as above theme of mutual flourishing, um, is that the macro on the like national, regional, international level is not in a good place.
Yeah,
And it's like it's not like setting low expectations. You can have high hopes but low expectations for that. Like there are a lot of big problems that have taken a long time to get to the place they're at, and they're going to take a long time to fix or heal. And so it's sort of pinning your hopes on help arriving from that level seems like a fragile strategy.
yeah,
But in terms of, and that doesn't mean that you're out of luck, and it doesn't mean that you have no help and whatever. It just means that, looking to each other. Because one of the things I really got to thinking about, and I think this is also Uranus and Taurus, is there's a tendency, at least probably, maybe it's primarily American, maybe it's just the Anglosphere, maybe it's beyond that, to think in terms of this sort of extended polarity where like a giant nation is going to provide for you, or you're going to be alone in the woods and hunting for every meal and utterly self-sufficient. And most of human history, for most of human history, the most effective strategy for survival and thrival has been like you work with friends and family,
yeah.
right? You may not be the perfect, can endure and thrive in any situation, right? You may not be perfectly robust yourself, no matter how hard you try, but with between your friends, your family, your crew, like, your clan, however you think about it. I don't have these skills, but my friend who lives 5 miles away does, right? And so as a meaningful unit, we can be tremendously robust. And I do think that that's an important part of, I don't know, should we say, getting rid of some of the empire virus, is remembering that we can help each other. It's not a macro state or utter isolation, that there are all these people and there are all these scales in between that.
Absolutely. And from a strategic perspective, there are some years where you can attempt a frontal assault, and there are other years where you have to go full terrorist. And that's kind of, I mean, we could do it now. One of the things we were looking at is what kind of heroes from fiction and story um, have lessons or opportunities for us to learn from in 2020, and one of them is the Invisibles, which is literally how I in my head structured the membership anyway, to have these sort of decentralized cells of utopianist magic users, right, who are geographically distributed, but and in some cases near each other and whatever, and the whole kind of like macro story of the Invisibles is in the face of that kind of the sort of mechanisms that you cannot defeat in a full frontal assault. There are still things you should do or can do and can do together. And that's kind of one of the I think that's what I mean by the opportunity. The invitation to be each other's light is 2020 is that kind of archonic mechanism, and we don't have standing armies, right? So there are other ways of contributing to flourishing rather than the open field strategies of Jupiter Sag.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Boy, I have a pile of thoughts about that. I remember you mentioned you suggested in a newsletter a couple months ago, like, hey, reread The Invisibles,
Yep.
and I was like, I would love to reread The Invisibles. Thank you for the excuse. And it was a joy, except for maybe the last bit, which I don't love the ending, and that's another conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But one of the things that I accidentally took from that, because I ordered like the Invisibles like fancy collected version, and a bunch of books on Yamblicus at the same time, and so they arrived on the same day. And I remember I was reading the Invisibles, and then I just like cracked open some Yamblicus, and it was the section where he is describing the different quality of different orders of spirits. He's talking about visible gods versus the invisible gods, and then he's talking about the archons and what they're like. And the archons, for those of you who haven't read the Invisibles, the archons are should we say, the antagonist of the Invisibles. And then one of the things that I was kind of surprised by is that Yamblicus is then talking about heroic souls, and differentiating them from sort of the normal humanness. And although the normal human soul is in his hierarchy beneath the sway of the archons, the heroes were two ranks above the
Yeah.
archons in terms of power and ability to structure reality. And he doesn't really talk about what differentiates a human from a heroic human, right? But and I think that differentiation is probably, to a certain degree, moment by moment. We all have heroic moments, right? When we shine brighter, and we're there for people, and we're just we're on fire in a way that we can't sustain normally, but we are that in that moment. And it just got me thinking about the Invisibles, because the Invisibles is literally people trying to rise to the heroic, and not just be sort of foil stamped with the factory pattern.
Yeah, exactly. I when she told me that the other day, it's in De Anima, where the Amblicus is talking about the different souls, and it's really, I had them written down. It's fascinating, right? It's almost like snakes and ladders. So there is a hierarchy of which ones can impact the others, and as you say, there's no heroism is in the doing. It's a verb almost rather than a noun, and you can kind of break free or circumvent around the other structure. And it's like he's got demons or archons. Divine souls are immaterial, so the effects that divine souls have is, and he means it in a Neoplatonic sense. It doesn't mean they don't have an effect. It literally means they have an immaterial effect. Demons or archons have an effective one. What have I got here? Humans have mortal acts, but heroes have great acts. And so you think, well, hang on, where do I go with this? And you can just tell, and it's in your own lives when you do things like, if for people who've joined recently, just helping other people for no reason. So the Christmas drive below this video, for instance, you can help an LGBT refugee who's had a really rough couple of years. You can just do that. And that's, I think, what I mean about the other light. And it was really interesting.
Yeah.
Iamblichus has that you at least temporarily and maybe permanently transform the universe with those heroic soul acts. And that, I think, is where we look for inspiration in 2020.
Yeah, and I think the perfect rider on that is something that we also came up in conversation. I think you said that you were thinking about Jupiter in Capricorn, and the image that fit for you was the moment where Gandalf falls into this, struggling with the Balrog.
Yep.
And in a sense, that's it's funny. I've had recently read Lord of the Rings, and the Jupiter Gandalf connection is very strong. On a very simple level, he's always calling giant eagles to help him. Like
Sure.
that's if there's a Jupiterian avatar bird, right? But he's in terms of just like the greater benefic within the party or the fellowship. And so he goes down, maybe forever. The other characters don't know. But then the rest of the party is like, okay, like the one who was sort of doing the heroing for us, we can all be mortal when Gandalf is around. But when Gandalf's gone, like somebody or some buddies, we have to step up and
Yep.
fill that more than human gap.
It's the other, well, Tolkien is, as is usually the case, but for me, definitely this year, the other place we look for the story of how to kind of navigate something like 2020. And that image was deliberately chosen for, as you said, the implications for the fellowship is like, okay, well, now it's up to us. Gandalf the Grey is explicitly Jupiter in Sag because the Grey Pilgrim, Mithrandir, is the kind of moving about the world being Gandalfy, right? Being teachery. And it's a necessary fool. It's a necessary fool. So the Gandalf that returns, Gandalf the White, isn't Jupiter in Sag. It's still Jupiter, but it's a necessary fool. And if that hadn't happened, they wouldn't have ultimately won in the end, because what you actually needed later on in the story, of course, is Gandalf the White. So it just seemed that it had nested implications for where we are now and how to look at Jupiter in Capricorn as a kind of necessary illumination. and yeah, and it's a thing. Obviously, Jupiter moves out of Capricorn, right? He's still got a ways to go before he becomes Gandalf the White, but that was kind of where I went with it, and I think it's the right moment in Lord of the Rings, in particular, for right now in the sky.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, one of the one of the standout pieces of the first quarter, very early in January, we have the perfection of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction. And so we've had Saturn and Pluto in the same sign within spitting distance since the beginning of 2018, but we get the one exact conjunction in January. And Saturn and Pluto is historically the least pleasant conjunction of any two planets. It is a conjunction that speaks to, as I've said before, building prisons, establishing thick, impermeable, insensitive barriers. It is a pageant for the archonic. It doesn't happen very often, but it happens regularly. The last Saturn-Pluto conjunction was in the early 80s, when this whole sort of corporate takeover of culture and medicine and everything else in the West got started. The one before that was just after World War II, when we had all of the boundaries that were created, all the national boundaries that were created just after World War II, which are still huge tension points. And then the one before that was right smack. It was right before and during World War I. And so it's a big power pivot moment for the macro. And it's, if you gaze into just that without any context and without remembering that there are other things that happen, it's super fucking depressing. I spent a day recently where I was only researching that piece, and I was I was just I was lost in the gloom until I woke up the next day. You
Well,
know, it's gazing directly into the eye of Sauron a little
yeah,
bit.
that permit me now that we've given people some optimism to pile on there. Those 3 points in history are all financial in the sense that you're looking at the devaluation of the pound versus gold in the lead up to World War One. You're looking at the beginnings of what would become Bretton Woods after World War Two, and you're looking at neoliberalism unleashed in the early 80s, right? So each time it's about the spells of how much things cost and who gets to determine it. And in January, we have the next kind of turning point in Armstrong's cycle, and it's quite a big one. And so, whatever happens in January, and how his model works for people who are unaware, is, and this is kind of going to be hopefully next week's solo show. Um, it's how I think astrology works because they're both cycle descriptions of reality, which is the events don't actually cause um, what would you call pebbles in a pond. Events don't cause the ripples. It's actually the kind of wave or cycle motion that kind of brings events to it. So if the markets
Like
move.
rubber duckies floating on waves.
Yeah, and but if the markets, he doesn't know what they are until we get to the point. Is how it works. So it's either a high or a low, depending on what happens. And by the looks of things, it's going to be a high. So that means there's a January turning point again in a kind of like macroeconomic sense with this particular configuration and a lineup with Armstrong's model where, and I mean anyone who's looking at the global economy, not just the US economy, from now for the next few years, is probably not hugely confident. So it's not like it's a wild prediction to say we might have some dramatic market events in January because now we've got Saturn Pluto and a turning point in the Armstrong cycle once again landing at around the same time.
Yeah, and you know, in January we also get eclipses piling on that. And again, really importantly, we have the absence of Jupiter and Sag.
Yes.
Right? Just the fact that you know, our right now our expectations are coming off of 12 and a half months of Jupiter and Sag, right? So that's what normal is. But that's, you know, that's not there anymore, right?
No. So we.
And so just
Like,
in terms of you're talking about, you know, Capricorn season. This is an incredibly Capricorn season. Lots of planets in Capricorn, lots of all that.
yeah, it's a reckoning in a sense, not in like a wrestling sense, in literally a um, putting numbers and quantifying sense. And as you say, without the Jupiter Sag angle, which I find hilarious because previously you could kind of fall down the stairs in your wedding dress and get covered in cake, and at the bottom of the stairs you'd be like, "Hey, $50." There's no $50 at the bottom of the stairs this time. You just fall. That's just what happens.
Yeah. Well, I think, but Jupiter is technically considered to be in the condition it's in Capricorn is that it's in its fall.
Yeah. Hence
Right,
Gandalf.
and so the, you know, Gandalf's descent, the like falling, that's it's an important piece. The fall of a planet is also in older texts referred to as its depression, and it's depression in a vertical sense, like a crater, like it's descending,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
And in some cases it can be like, oh, I've fallen and I can't get up, or I'm falling and I need some help. You know, it's easier to stumble in that terrain for a planet in terms of the things that it normally tries to do.
Sure. So those eclipses you mentioned, is there anything else? The January eclipses. Is there anything else we want to say about them, or shall we move to what have I got next? I've got like Mars in 2020 from Feb is what I've written, but March and April we need to talk a little bit more about the Aquarius action, I think. But is there anything else about the eclipses in Jan?
Yeah, so I mean, it's just like another big dose of Cancer Capricorn stuff. It's like the meat grinder, but without the Mars. Mars is not participating in that, so you don't have that sort of adrenalized inflammation, and there's not a Mercury retrograde that overlaps. It's just Saturn, Pluto eclipses. They're going to be really familiar themes. It's not going to. It's going to be another installment of like, oh yeah, this I know what this is like, and you might be totally prepared and great at it by now. You might just be like, oh my God, not another. But it's more of that.
Gotcha.
And that's basically our January.
Like you said, it's a meat grinder without the Mars. So you're making sausages, but not chorizo. Um, yeah. Cool. That actually
I
tracks for
prefer
me.
the chorizo.
Yeah. That tracks for me because I'm doing ayahuasca again in January, and the kind of unfurling of the dieta and the processing and actual absorption of the medicine happened in July. So during the meat grinder. So if it's the same, but it's like but without the jungle spice, that would track on a personal level for me. And that's good.
Yeah,
I can prepare for that.
right. It's not. It's just the purging. You don't have to travel 6,000 miles and coordinate this and that and that. But it's a repetition.
Cool. All right. So
And then once the sun clears Capricorn, which it does like January 20th, 21st, we move into basically pretty workable skies where it's not like one of the things that I was forced to do as I took this year seriously is instead of looking for like, oh my God, what's going to be amazing, it was sort of like, okay, well, there's not a whole lot of amazing, but what is like a period of relative calm, relative like workability where there's plenty to work with, rather than rather than getting served a challenge and having to orient your focus to that. And so, I would say, like let's say January 20th to about February 10th is relatively, it's pretty workable. It's a good window. It's not perfect. There's some issues, but it's workable. And then basically middle of February, we get two things that click in right next to each other. One is we get a Mercury retrograde, which starts on the February 16th, runs till March 9th, and that's those are what they are. We get 3 of them a year. It's not, hardly news, but it's worth noting because it just changed your planning for that period. More importantly, or as importantly, if not more, is that on February 15th, the day before Mercury stations retrograde, Mars moves into Capricorn. So that begins a roughly 6-week period of Mars in Capricorn with Jupiter and the South Node and Pluto and Saturn, right? So you were talking about extended Capricorn seasons, right? And that is 4 things in Capricorn for another 6 weeks once the sun is gone. And Mars is what's interesting about that is that so it's Mars Saturn together. Mars Saturn together, that's a that can be super gnarly. One thing that's important to note is that Mars and the single sign that Mars and Saturn are both happiest in is Capricorn. Mars is exalted in Capricorn, and then Saturn is rules Capricorn, or is at home there. And so it's gnarly. It's definitely not going to be positive for everybody. But as far as a Mars Saturn thing, it is easier to turn towards favorability. And and Jupiter's there too. And so but it's hard ass. Mars Saturn is hard. When it's positive, it's still hard ass. It's not positive in terms of cupcake delivery. It's positive in terms of here is exactly the legendary weapon you need to slay the legendary beast.
Mm-hmm. I like that. That's a it's
certainly more favorable, generally speaking, than the Mars in Aries, Saturn in Capricorn configuration, which we'll have later.
That is the two towers configuration. There you go. That's Isengard and Barad-dûr. So the token is the gift that keeps on giving.
Yeah.
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 Cool. So there's some gaps. There's some more right parts in Feb. The Mars story, the Mars of 2020 story, begins kind of in earnest with ingress into Capricorn. So we should maybe talk like March, April
Yep.
Aquarius action. Like what? Admittedly, it's retrograde with their slow planets, but how is Saturn in Aquarius, which is also a Saturnine sign, obviously, different to Saturn in Capricorn? Because we're going to get a preview of what it does next.
Yeah. So, interesting to note, Saturn is the only planet that traditionally has its two home bases right next to each other. Everybody else has, if they rule multiple signs, they're somewhere else. But Saturn's at home in Capricorn and at home in Aquarius. So what doesn't change is that it's still super strong Saturn. However, Saturn in Capricorn is, it's Saturn in an Earth sign, right? And so it has to do with the environment on a physical, on a as it is level. Saturn in Capricorn is a lot more, has a lot more to do with navigating the terrain you find yourself in. And maybe you move to a different part of the terrain, but and maybe you do a little landscaping, but like you don't move the mountain because it's blocking your view, right? You move your view so that the mountain doesn't block it. Whereas Saturn in Aquarius is it's an air sign version of Saturn. It has a lot more to do. So Saturn is always interested in rules and structure. And so with Aquarius, active air element Saturn, it's thinking about, okay, what rules or structure could we do? Right? What rules and structure might we impose on this situation, or what it's more active. It's forward looking into like, well, what can we do here, or what should the law be? Whereas Capricorn is very much like, well, these are the rules of the world in which I find myself. How do I navigate those? Right? So Saturn in Aquarius is much more proactive. Another huge thing is the planet that is that when Saturn was in Capricorn, as it is now, it's just hanging out with Pluto, right? Which intensifies the thickness of the walls and the immovability of pieces of the landscape. In Aquarius, Saturn will be square, in and out of a 90-degree to Uranus and Taurus. So Saturn-Uranus as a pairing is Saturn-Uranus as a pairing throws rules up into the air. Whereas Saturn-Pluto doubles down on them. If you're playing Monopoly with Saturn-Pluto, you are held. It's like playing with a rules lawyer who will pull out the instructions and read it verbatim and hold you to that. Playing Monopoly with Saturn-Uranus is somebody like literally flips up the gaming board and all the pieces go everywhere. It's much more chaotic.
Yeah,
in a good way and a bad way.
Yeah, so that's how I play Monopoly. So now I know how. Now I know how to deal with that.
Or somebody takes like their miniature of their Dungeons and Dragons character and places it on the Monopoly board and tells you that it can move up to 30 squares as to its choosing, and you're like, but that's not. And they're like, I'm playing. It's like an introduction.
I was looking for cinematic villains to match to it. And maybe I got it right, maybe I didn't. But so Saturn in Capricorn is the T100 specifically, not the T1000. It's a kind of like relentless and almost
Oh,
like it doesn't change in speeds. Whereas the villain for Saturn Aquarius is, and bearing in mind I haven't seen the Joker film, the most recent one, is the Joker. It might not be because I haven't seen the most recent film, but just in general, if you think about the Joker from graphic novels or some of the earlier films, that's what I had in my head. And now, after you've said that, I don't know. What do you think?
yeah, I think that's good, especially the I haven't seen the new film either. The Heath Ledger Joker, I think, really captured the sort of the archetype of the supervillain who just wants to watch it burn or wants to create chaos for its own sake, versus, which stands in distinction to the, even if, how should we say, monstrous, the understandable villain who just wants to
Yes.
control everything and to own it, right? Versus the like, well, why? But this doesn't even benefit you. It doesn't. That's not the point, right? It's just
Okay.
chaos. Um,
That's what I had. That was the kind
if
of
we're gonna,
difference I was going with. It's like Saturn Aquarius is Joker, so we should get an indication of that, or we should watch out for how that looks in Q1 when we get it back slowly. I mean, again, they're slow moving planets. Is there anything materially different about the fact that it's a directional change, or is it just once we get Saturn in Aquarius, we should be able to like taste what that is in the air?
yeah. So yeah, on a personal level and on a like reading the collective level. So again, Saturn in Aquarius is Saturn not in Capricorn, right? So if you're like me and Saturn in Capricorn is right on your shit, there'll be like a little bit of there'll be a little breath of there'll be a little bit more room to breathe, right? If Saturn in Capricorn was pleasantly off angle for you and Aquarius is right on your shit, then you'll be like, okay, that's what's coming next. But the Saturn and Aquarius story is really going to be 2021,
Yeah.
2022. But we just get that introduction in Q2 of this year. And so again, like look at where the Saturn, look at and feel where the Saturn isn't during that as well as where it is.
All right, that's
And so
alarming
one
for
thing I
me.
need to mention with this is that so we've got Mars and Saturn in Capricorn from mid-February, basically right up until the end of March. And the really what I thought was an irritating thing is that Saturn enters Aquarius on March 21st. So interesting, we've got these big things right on the solstitial and equinoctial points.
Yeah.
So right on the equinox, Saturn enters Aquarius, and then like 10 days later, Mars just follows Saturn into Aquarius. So then we have another 6 weeks of Mars and Saturn in the same sign. And so
That,
it's a harsh introduction to Saturn Aquarius.
yeah, that's fucked. Sorry. Yeah. Um,
Yeah, I like there are a lot of points where I was just going through the granular details, and I was like, really, that seems uncharitable.
yeah, that's overkill. Come on. That's okay.
Yeah,
Uh,
if we got the Mars thing on, but yeah, it does. Again, it's the Mars and the Saturn, and Mars just tags along. Saturn's like, I'm gonna go over here now, and Mars is like, that's great. I let's pack a lunch for two.
right. So I just don't know enough about Batman anymore. I can probably extend it to like, it's when one of the villains teams up with another one, but I can really only think of Harley Quinn, and that's not quite right for Mars. Maybe actually it is for Mars and Aquarius because that is like blowing stuff up. Like it's quite pyrotechnic. I don't know. I wonder there'll be a Batman villain I can add to it. I just don't know that stuff anymore. We got old. Um,
Yeah, that Harley's not. It's not a bad match. There might be something better, but that's not. That's not in another universe. That's at least in the
yeah,
ballpark.
yeah. So it'd be a pass mark, but I'm sure there are nerds out there who'd be like, as a matter of fact, and they'd be correct. so and so, whoever it is. All right, cool. So that's like March/April. Um, do we want to do Venus retrograde?
Yeah, we really should. So Venus, Venus, we get a Venus retrograde every year and a half or so. So some years we get them, some years we don't. So we're due. So this next one is it stations retrograde on May 12th, and it stations direct on June 24th. However, and this is in Gemini. However, it's just like when we have Mercury retrogrades, and it means that Mercury's in the same goddamn place forever.
Yeah.
Same thing, but extended for Venus. And so we have like 4 months of Venus in Gemini, with 6 weeks of retrograde in the middle of it, right? So Venus is in Gemini from early April on, and it's in Gemini in August, right? So get to know Venus in Gemini. And with the retrograde, again, like kind of just solid second half of Q2. Venus retrogrades, just like Mercury retrogrades, often involve going backwards to rethink things, finding the email that you missed that had the important information. Having to refile paperwork, having to, it's all do-overs to get it right on a information data level. With Venus, it's do-overs to get things right on a passions, motivations, relational level. Whereas, and so we have the same sort of underworld journey in terms of the movement from visibility to invisibility with both Mercury and Venus retrogrades. But with Venus, the underworld journey it's not the lighthearted Mercury psychopomp jaunt. It's the much more heartfelt and vulnerable Inanna through the underworld, Inanna Eresh Kegal sort of journey in it longer. And so it's about it's about purifying, cleaning relationships. I would say also the relational self. And it's it goes down and digs into some of those more catonic wells of passion, the feelings of hurt from when you were 10 that you're still that are still affecting your partnerships with people, or your tensions with a brother and sister from when you were younger that you still play out with your friends. Like these sort of like hidden underlying emotional patterns that affect that characterize that we still carry in our relational self.
That's good. I like that.
But,
I can frame that well. Just I'm doing this selfishly on a personal level. I had quite a good from that angle. Venus retrograde in Scorpio, in terms of pulling things out. But as you say, it's not that Mercury retrograde's gentle. People tend to gloss over the motifs associated with Venus in the underworld, but we are talking about violent sexual assault and abduction, right? Like we did the Eresh Kigal in another one, but everyone does the same thing. Persephone, like, yay, Persephone's back, so things can grow. And she was abducted. Like you're dealing with like people being, well, women. It is the height of vulnerability and nowhere to hideness is what I'm looking for. And yeah, that was what I wanted to jump in there. As you kind of pointed at, like, this isn't your pedestrian Mercury retrograde. It's much more of a raw nerve, or that relational self thing. There's nowhere to hide from the Venus retrogradeness.
Yeah, well, and yeah, the felt vulnerability is really key, both to describing Venus retrogrades as well as, I would say, getting them right, or doing the best you can with them. Because in the Inanna story, a big part of it is her having to shed her relics of power and her clothing, right? It's not just that she's forced to get naked. She has super powerful regalia and talismans that protect and empower her that she has to get rid of as she goes into the underworld, right? And so, it's the facing of, facing the bottom of the underworld without all of your, your cool super weapons and protection and amulets and, all of that. But that's also, there are also certain truths that we can't get to if we roll in armored, right?
Absolutely.
And so, after every Venus retrograde, I always hear from people come out with a renewed sense of like who they're connected to, why they've like gone through the complicated part and processed that. And sometimes relationships, sometimes when clarity comes at the bottom of the underworld, you're like, oh, we don't need to continue doing this. But vice versa, that same certainty applies to, oh, and that's exactly why I'm sticking with you. And now I've clarified that. I'm not like, well, we're together, but, you're kind of like this, and I'm not so sure about, right? There's a clarification where it's like, oh, no, am I in or out? And for people that have that Venus retrograde hitting, let's say on a professional level, that can be like, oh, I don't know, what am I doing? I kind of am doing this, and it's kind of working, but I kind of hate it. It's a clarification of the passion. Like, what do you really want? And, you come out of that, be like, no, I don't want that, and I do want this. And, if, you need that, we need that 6 months every year and a half to get that kind of relational clarity, whether it's relating to people or, what do we want out of this part of our life? What are we doing?
Absolutely. And it's the best planet for it because it is that moving raw nerve, but also the call to be gentle with yourself about it, particularly with Venus, as you say, because it's got to station and come back over the territory it just retrograded through. And we're in agreement that the Inanna story is actually about Eresh Kigal. And one of the things that I think people miss, and it's important, and I have this in the members area for the video associated with Venus retrograde and Scorpio, is Inanna leaves or is forced to remove all the pretty things, but also her items of power, and it's a reminder because she was Eresh Kigal basically makes the case that there's her sister up there in the mortal world, hanging out at parties and getting to live this great life and looking down on her sister for being in the underworld. And it's like, hang on.
Right.
Let's see what you look like with this gone and this gone and this gone and this gone. And it's that raw nerve looking at what you actually are, and the things that you move towards, that kind of Venus joy thing. But because it is Venus, you'll get that experience, and you just have to be reminded to be gentle with yourself in the process, because it's still Venus. It will come good by the end of that journey. As you say, you will know with clarification of this is what I am, or this is that relational lesson, and this is the direction I'm moving in. But it's quite the ride, because you get your underworld sister calling you on your shit when it happens.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's literally like, let me strip you of all of your privileges. Like, come down here where the unfortunate souls go when they die, right? And watch that. Yeah. Right? Watch that. Be here with this without all the veils protecting you. Yeah. And so, there's like real vulnerability calls out that sense, that gentleness, right? But it's not, like there's definitely a look at, there's a drawing of the eye to what is, and in Venus, Venus is the planet of aesthetics. Like, what is by definition ugly, like, which is usually rejected, because normally Venus is about figuring out what do we think is beautiful and fun, and then collecting those things and drawing those experiences into our life. But then we build up a pattern. You build up, the drain gets clogged with all of the rejected things, right? Which are from that aesthetic level ugly in the sense that they didn't make the cut into what you were trying to collect.
Yeah, it's good, and that's the anonymous cycle is perfect for that as well, which is it is about aesthetics and what you find beautiful, and also what the cost of that is, because that's the whole point. Inanna can only have the life she has in the upper world because Eresh Kigal is keeping all the ugly down there, and it's that cost. It's like, okay, well, this is the cost of your beauty and your aesthetics. Like, yes, you're beautiful because I keep the ugly.
Yeah, those gems had to be mined.
Yes,
Right, people
exactly.
had to descend into the mountain.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so I'm low key. It's a weird way of saying it. I'm going to be back in the jungle, but I'm low key looking forward to that. As I said, I think famous last words. I have the rhythm of Venus retrogrades down, and the key is to be gentle with yourself because it is a moving raw nerve, and just that's arguably the case with all retrogrades, right? But in particular with Venus, just let it do its thing, and it'll be a raw nerve, and then it'll not be a raw nerve coming through.
Yeah, there's a lot of like, I don't know how to say, like uh, in the approach that I see working best to Venus retrogrades, there's a dealing with acknowledging and dealing with what arises, what comes up, but it kind of, yeah, actually, I don't want to use a septic system metaphor, but I'm going to. Like, it comes up and you'll deal with that, but you don't necessarily need to you don't need to dive into the sewers necessarily. If you want to, it's really easy to, and that there are times and places and practices that make sense of that. But it's really dealing with the underworld will show you what portions of it are relevant for you now. You don't have to do like a complete cartography, emotional cartography of the entire realm. Like you deal with the parts that that grab you by the sleeve,
No,
that bubble up.
absolutely. All right, so that brings us. Is there anything else in June until we get to the end, which we've briefly spoken about, until we get to like the 24th, or give or take, that also
Well,
needs
we've
to
just
be mentioned?
so it's worth noting that mid-May we get done with Venus in Aquarius. So we actually have Mars and Saturn in a different sign. Or sorry, yeah, Mars moves into Pisces from Aquarius, right? Mid-May. So Mars and Saturn are actually in different signs for the first time since mid-February. And so that Mars and Pisces will intersect with the Venus retrograde in ways that might inflame it a little bit, but it's not Mars and Saturn. And so one of the things that does is it also lets us see from basically mid-May until the end of June, it lets us see just Saturn in Aquarius without the Mars admixture.
That's good. Okay. So that's when,
Yeah.
that's when we can get a clean picture of if it is in fact the Joker. Yeah. Okay.
You're like, okay, so yeah. So when you're aggravated, you turn into the Joker. That's Saturn in Aquarius himself. But then there's also there's a very design for a better side to Saturn in Aquarius. It's a much more idealistic position than Capricorn. Capricorn is, Saturn Capricorn is very much is super pragmatic, and it's like, well, this is how this part of the world works. Let's optimize for this part of the world. Saturn Aquarius is like, can we design a better world? And that's the non, the more heroic or well-intended side, which we will see some of next year, especially when Jupiter and Saturn are both in Aquarius together.
Yeah, I like that. No, so there is something good about 2021. 2021 isn't quite. Yeah, whatever. This is one extended year. This is this is what's going on. I suppose everything is. Speaking of that, like, are there? We chatted about this in Portland, but are there any? One of the things that I think we successfully got across was there is no returning to normalcy for years, right? Arguably, if ever, in terms of the structures that either people have come to rely on or erroneously rely on or hope are there one way or the other. They are just not in play. And it's one of the interesting things on the longer term that I find fascinating that lines up with Armstrong's model, right? So is there anything else? We are just talking about H1 2020 in some sense, but looking at that longer view out to 2024 and what have you, are there any other things about that? We discussed it a little bit at the opening, but is there anything else that we need to chat to people about in that context?
Yeah, so a few things about that, like just the decade that we're entering, it's very consistently weird. It's one thing and then another. It's not all bad, but we're definitely not going back to the order of things like circa late 90s, circa 2005. Like that's that's in many ways we are at this 2019. 2019 in many ways was the how should we say, the conclusion of stories that have been running for 20 or 40 years.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was thinking about, and so let me pull it back to the long cycle, the triplicity cycle, which I've talked about before, but I'll just do a very brief overview. So the triplicity cycle, the Jupiter-Saturn triplicity cycle, is the oldest and, how should we say, probably most concise planetary cycle for looking at big history. Because of their relative speeds and their orbits, Jupiter and Saturn conjoin almost exactly every 20 years. And they do so in signs of the same element, fire, water, earth, or air, for about 200 years at a time. And so that gives us elemental eras of about 200 years. And so we are the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which is in the very last, it's literally the last week and a half of 2020, moves us out of a 200-ish year cycle and then into a new one. We're moving from, we did Earth, we've been doing Earth for the last 200-ish years, we're going to do air. Now, these big cycles have overlap periods at the end beginning. And so the marker, the end of 2020 Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, it ends the overlap period and moves us irretrievably into the air cycle, right? The overlap period began in the early 80s. And so we basically, if you're less than 40 years old, you've been in this overlap period. And regardless how old if you're older than we've still been in this the whole time. And one of the things that I was reflecting on that's really interesting is that a lot of the most accurate sci-fi and dystopian visions in literature that we had that map to exactly where we are, many of these were all written in the first couple of years of the 80s. Like, if we look at cyberpunk, we look at William Gibson, like that's more or less where we are. We're in the corporate-ruled cyberpunk dystopia. If we look at the Christian fascist dystopia of was it Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, then it's like yes, there's a large totalitarian Christian movement that if it was totally in control would create something not unlike that. And so it's interesting. We got this preview of like what couldn't go wrong in this next cycle at the very beginning of the overlap, and now we've come to a point where it's like, okay, so where do we go from cyberpunk dystopia, right? Everybody's walking around with surveillance devices / extremely convenient tiny pocket-held computers. Like, we are at the point that our dystopia has got us to, and now we're due to start beginning to solve for those problems which were accurately foreseen in fiction 40 years ago.
Yeah, it's good. I know we discussed it before from a cyberpunk angle, but you're right. It never really occurred to me that 2020 is the essentially the fulfillment or the technological fulfillment of everything cyberpunk. Like, there's no more in cyberpunk that's left to happen. There's total surveillance. There's like corporate and police states. There are these weird little devices and multiple identities across meat space and in the webs. That's really interesting. Like, there are no remaining cyberpunk shoes left to drop. Like, it's all done. So it is
Right.
when we move into air, like,
right, like the fancy prosthetics are already made and will be like, they just need to be more available. But like, we've got robot hands. The data jacks into people's heads will be coming very soon, and no one will be surprised. We've got the issue of AI. It's almost all retrospective at this point. And so it's like, okay, well, but how do we move forward from there, right? Rather than like, oh my God, what if that happens?
Yeah, they've all been done. We need another one. That's cool. And let it be utopian. Like, we still are waiting on most of the good Star Trek technologies, at least publicly. So, and transporters have got to be a triplicity of air development for sure.
We can hope so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, and I will just add to that, to the William Gibson cyberpunk thing. The popular role-playing game Shadowrun, which basically took William Gibson's cyberpunk dystopia and added magic coming back into the timeline. Like, that's also that's actually maybe as accurate, if not more, than just the sort of materialist Gibson version. Because magic and astrology, it's not just that they've had a good couple of years publicly. Like the revival and how should we say, the strengthening, the restoration of practice that has happened as a result of a 20-year textual revival is extraordinary. Like, we know how to do things now that nobody knew how to do 25 years ago. Like, the magic is fucking strong.
It is.
And that's still coming together. It's almost like I don't know. It's extraordinary. Please go on.
No, it is. And I kind of mentioned this at the beginning, why I'm still, I do think astrology, because it's just having a moment in the sun, is culturally experiencing a bubble moment. So it'll probably get smaller as an industry over the medium term, but not by that much. Same thing with banking. But what is crucial, and this is the first time in history it's ever happened, right? Which is that there are probably more people practicing astrology in a Hellenistic context, let's leave the rest of the world out of it, than there ever have been, including in the Hellenistic era, because you're numbering in tens of thousands, right? But also, their data are shared. So this is what's really, really interesting to me from a kind of data background perspective of, well, when we get something like Saturn showing up in Aquarius, we can look horizontally at what's particularly practicing astrologers, how that's showing up in people's charts, as well as how it's showing up in the world. And we're accumulating data. So astrology in the 21st century is like definitionally getting better. And it's almost, as Jeff Bezos says about the internet, it's day one of the internet. It's day one of the new astrology.
Yeah, it is. And the new astrology, probably a lot of it looks like much, how should we say, a much more nuanced, there's more data, there's more nuance. Like, what does this look like in this context? But it's also, I think, showing that, like, oh, well, they got it right like 1,700 years ago. Like, no, I looked at this thing that Firmicus wrote in the Empire, in the Western Roman Empire, and that totally works. And I've actually got a data set that supports that.
Yeah.
Part of that is being, and the same thing with magic is like, part of the data set allows you to be more certain about things. Seem pretty good, but you don't have the same data set with the tools.
No, exactly.
Or you don't have the same data set without those tools.
So it's the practice of astrology and magic in the triplicity of air, because you build off. And the good thing about big data, it's an overused term, but the good thing about high volumes of data is that it swamps out the bad. So if you get 100,000 surveys, some people are going to troll you. You'll get, under 1% of people will be faking it, or donkey voting, whatever you want to call it. The same thing can happen in astrology and magic, because the volumes of people who are doing it correctly, or that have data that can provide intelligence, swamps those that are kind of messing with it. And that in both cases, well, I've noticed it with the membership, that we can build with a high degree of confidence on the data that we've generated from doing things like the intention experiments and so on, so that we kind of can learn. It's not machine learning, but it is that kind of triplicity of air medicine of almost ephemeral building, or something. I don't know, but I'm really, really bullish about the.
No,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, it's the way that a culture learns as a system.
Yeah.
Because if we just take like we take some branch of magic, or we take some book, we take the Hunting Man's Handbook, the Cunning Man's Handbook, and everybody works the same like set of experiments and compares notes. There's a system learning that's all comprised of completely authentic in human intelligence, not artificial, but cultural systems learn, and they learn better under certain circumstances, with lots of feedback, lots of boots on the ground, lots of skin in the game. And so, I just think of, some of the things I've seen on your forums where, you get like 20, you get 20 people to do, it's like, okay, do this magic, like do this particular, ceremony or rite or whatever, this operation, without a lot of like telling you what you should see or whatever. And then you just, you check back with people, and, 10 people were like, yeah, I also saw this kind of weird dragon thing, even though that wasn't in the description. You're like, okay, well, that's a piece that's not in the book.
Yes, exactly.
And it's
yeah.
With astrology too, it's like same thing.
No, exactly. So we should jump to the questions, I think. Unless there's any other things for
Actually,
8-1.
I have one more rider on that point.
You do that.
The magic and astrology are good and getting better.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you do that, because remember I had to do that restart, so I get my document set up. So you entertain the crowd while I while I open up the doc.
Okay. All right. Well, so what I was thinking, this is something I made a note of. I was thinking about when we were talking earlier about, how do you say, forming robust communities, clans, crews, families, et cetera, et cetera. One of the ways that how good the magic and astrology are right now fits into that is, so not everybody is going to be the magical expert in your adventuring party. If you happen to be the person who's been developing that, then like it's, that's not just your weird hobby. Like, I don't want to say it's your responsibility, but it kind of is, to be the person that can do that for your community. And that I don't mean that you have to like start be the village wizard. But one thing I've experienced, and I see other people experience, like, I if you study this stuff and you practice, you get good at certain things that are very specialized skills. And so this last year, there's been a collective focus as well as a personal focus in my life on helping people navigate the death state. Right? If you've been doing ancestor stuff and it makes sense to you and you're good at it, and somebody in your family passes, then if you're the only one of the cousins or whatever who knows, how to do that, or knows how to help on that level, then that's kind of that's your role. And it might be that nobody else in your family understands what you're doing, or it might be that there's only one or two of them and they whisper with you, but they don't want to sort of advocate that in whatever the out in the open is. But the point isn't for everybody to be, a specialist magic user. Like, that would be inauthentic for a lot of people. But, this is a Rude Soup podcast. A lot of you are more likely to be those people, and thinking about how to be that. Not jumping to a macro, like you're going to change the conversation on all social media or the public perception of astrology or magic or whatever tradition you practice, but that you're going to make your system, your little system, stronger and healthier because you know what you're doing, and who else is going to do it.
And that it's perfect because, funnily enough, it lands right on. I just opened up the document. Rebecca's first question, which would be, what would be yours number one tip for navigating this year? Sorry if that's too vague, but I actually think you just landed on it, because I was going to respond with, that's baked into almost every page of Lord of the Rings, which is, you do the thing that you can do. To the best of your ability where you are. The thing that you're good at might not be the thing that the other person's good at. Definitely speak to them. The membership's very good at, we have people who are quite good at death or angel stuff, and we've got that going horizontally. But even in the absence, the temporary, I would surmise, absence of your own rhizomatic network, the small thing that you're good at that's heading in the direction of mutual flourishing is my number one tip for navigating this year. It's that, be each other's light. I don't know if you want to add more to it.
No, I think that's perfect.
Cool. Question 2 is from Tonya. It seems that Jupiter in Sagittarius is all about thinking big, beautiful dreams, and that Jupiter in Capricorn is about making those dreams a reality. What are the best beginning steps for starting, like points and choices for finding a mutually flourishing trailhead? I like that. And what tools should we acquire to hack our way through the wild? I'm going to go first. Funnily enough, it's almost the same, but not quite. Begin the year, or rather end this year, with inspiration. And I know I mentioned it when I had Becca on the show, but have the Earthsea Quartet on Audible or Lord of the Rings on Audible, and just situate yourself in the right kind of story to open the year is a universal medicine. It isn't even set up an altar to blah blah blah. It's deeper than that in a funny way. I don't know. What are your tips for that as a beginning point to find a mutually flourishing trailhead? I think is cute.
Yeah. So I like what you said. I also think with Jupiter and Capricorn, it's in an Earth sign. There's the look around and see what you've already got. I think with the Jupiter in Sag, there was a lot of dreaming something new, something that's not already part of your reality system, pulling something new into it, whether it's learning a new ability or unlocking something. It was additive. Jupiter in Capricorn is don't neglect what's just been sitting in the corner. A lot of the sort of good ideas, or I think they're good ideas, that I've had over the last, week or so since Jupiter moved into Cap, was realizing I was oh, I have 700,000 words of old writing that I'm not doing anything with. Maybe some of that stuff that I wrote in columns could be useful for something. right?
Mm.
And that's part of the Jupiter with the Saturn and Pluto vibes. Is the Jupiter, the win, the good thing comes out of that, like that past, that trash heap. And then on a social level, like, looking around and looking at, who's been a real friend to you, and in your mind at least, like formalizing that, right? Be like, oh no, that's somebody who, like, if they're in trouble, like, I'm not going to think about how it's inconvenient to help them. I'm going to help them. Like
Mm.
looking at who you're really, who's in your party, whether you recognize it at that level or not. And then one last thing, this is there are rough skies this year. Um, I think part of the move this year is, if you've got that big dream seed, is keeping it from dying in the winter frost.
Hmm.
Just because it can't bloom right now doesn't, like, I think on a collective level, especially as an American, like, the best I can dream of this year is holding the line against a lot of bad things. Is it, like, but there are a lot of really big problems that have developed over decades that aren't going to get reversed this year. It doesn't mean that I don't want to see them reversed, and doesn't mean that they
Yes.
can't be, but I've got to be more patient than that. And if I want things to get really better, then I need to like be a medium to long term optimist, and that means keeping that optimism alive during hard months.
A medium to long term optimist and a short term realist. It's a really good point, really good metaphor with the seed. And I had this discussion because I've run the numbers for the wealth magic course that's going to start next year. Um, if you it seems like here's a good question. If you were to try to get a mortgage now, when you are, let's say you make 50 grand and you get a mortgage, and your mortgage is 35 years, or you wait several years and you're making 110 grand and you end up with a 15-year mortgage. If you wait, you will still achieve the goal of having your home fully owned faster by waiting. So the fact that you have to keep the seed and don't plant it in the Capricorn soil of 2020 doesn't mean you are delaying the flourishing of the tree. Like, it literally can't grow if it's too cold. So that's a really, really good point. Um, Delaying or not pursuing for strategic reasons is not necessarily a setback, especially if going forward with it would fail. Right. But so that, like, get better with shorter and longer timelines, I think, is a hugely important point.
Yeah, and just because it can't happen right now doesn't mean that it's the wrong idea,
Exactly.
or that it can't happen.
Exactly. It's been interesting because we've done a couple of seasons now. There has to be a certain soil temperature or the seeds won't obviously start growing right. So we've had a really cold spring because one of the other things that the Martin Armstrong model lines up with is that the solar minimum is in January. So as we head into that, like, colder period over the next decade, like, that change happens in January as well. But, like, because we've had a cold start to the season, if we put things in the ground, like, we missed it because we were busy, we went to Fiji and so on, they wouldn't have grown. The soil was still too cold. So just, yeah, that's a really good point. I'm loving it. We'll move on to the next question. I think it's phrased, I'm going to
Thank
try and
you.
answer it. The next year feels like an opportunity for a multi-month ritual that can bear fruit in the future. Would such a ritual be better aimed at a magical result or a material result? That's from Brett. Brett, um, I would, before I answered that, redefine a lot of the words that you have used in that question. Um, because I think you're saying magical and material, meaning magical is non physical. And that's not how magic works. I don't think there's a wrong time. It's cart before the horse. So don't pick some space weather for a nice long multi-month ritual. Work out the thing that you're pursuing, and see how it is, because there's ultimately never a bad time to be pursuing your goals with magic. It's just it changes differently. So don't wait for gaps unless you wanted to take 6 months off and do the Melon. But why? Um, Other than that, just if you need something that requires magic, just do magic. Use the timing available to you, but don't wait around for a multi-month window. Anything else?
Yeah. So one, it's just important to differentiate the part of magic which is astrological magic from all the other things. So if you're doing astrological magic, then you absolutely want to time it to certain configurations. Those ongoing configurations may strengthen or impede other kinds of operations, but it's not, it falls back into just weather, right? And I know that, a lot of times when I talk about astrological magic, I'll be very nitpicky about planetary configurations because you have to be.
Yeah.
But if you're not doing it, especially if there's no multi-month astrological magic in the Picatrix,
Yes.
or in Agrippa, right?
Yeah.
If you're doing like a longer empowerment regimen, right, or a longer building thing, you are inevitably going to have favorable and unfavorable skies throughout those cycles, right?
It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what
and
Venus is doing in the sky on Friday. If you want to do like daily planetary prayers, every Friday Venus gets a prayer. It doesn't matter what is happening in this. Like, so you could do that, Brett, if you were going to do like a daily. If you're talking about doing a daily meditation regimen or something, just start it. And same thing with something like planetary or planetary angelic prayers. It's always going to be Friday when it's Friday. It doesn't matter what Venus is doing.
Yeah, well, and it does matter, but not in a way that should make you not do that. It's actually doing daily planetary observances like that, which I've done for a couple years now. Well, maybe more than a couple. I'll feel the difference when I do the Venus daily thing when it's conjunct Saturn versus when it's exalted or versus when it's doing whatever. I'm like, oh yeah, checking in with Venus. Yep, that's how Venus is doing. And it's actually the encounter with that variance the encounter with that variability is one of the great advantages of that, because you're staying with the moment, and you're also getting an understanding of the range of Venus moments, right, or the range of Saturday moments. And then also, thinking about, when I think of multi-month things, I have a bunch of multi-month things I'm going to be doing. From a if you're doing to ping off your recent podcast with Phil Hine, like there are a lot of both remediative or medicinal practices as well as empowerment practices, which people do in Tantra and Vedic astrology, and the overlap where you're doing, let's say, I did 9 months of Kali practice every night over this last year. And I did that regardless of where the things were. And that the timing for a lot of those kind of practices is actually that internal clock that I described earlier, that other timing methods of astrology work on, rather than what's happening in the sky. What's happening in the sky matters, but the internal timing of your being, of your life, is actually in the Vedic astrology tradition that I'm trained in. That's what we use primarily for timing practices, is what fruit is trying to bloom in, what trees are flowering for you, right? What's trying to bloom, whether the fruit is bitter or sweet. That's how, that's what you orient the practice around.
Good one. I like this. This is from Shakira. Can we talk about Saturn stationing on Altair?
I think that might be a little bit too granular, because if we bring that in, we've got to bring the fact that Mars and Saturn can join right next to Altair as well, and I think that's interesting and super relevant. And also also Saturn and Jupiter will conjoin right next to Altair at the end of the year, like that.
Really?
I think we should probably Yeah. So great eye. right? Relevant, but like granular in a way that I think will pull the discussion sideways and
Cool.
create too much focus on one thing. But yeah, it's happening. And so, on a very simple level, those first couple degrees of Aquarius sure are important
Yeah,
for this
sure.
next bit.
Yeah, okay. That's personal homework for me. From Thomas, how do the decans color the meat grinder transits? Let's widen that out. Obviously, that came through when we were talking about the meat grinder, I guess. Um, decans and planets, or decans and transits. Like, is there ways that we should be thinking with both of them simultaneously?
Well, yeah. So the decans are a couple things. One of them is that they are the zodiac at 3 times magnification, which gives you a much more detailed picture of what the dynamics are in that little area of reality, right? Instead of dividing reality into 12, we're dividing into 36, and so every one of those is going to be much more descriptive than just by sign, and so when you use the decans to describe what's going on. So, for example, if we're looking at, Mars in the first decan of, well, actually, let me use an example. Here's a good one. So that Saturn-Pluto conjunction, it's in Capricorn.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also, by the way, America's first Pluto return. America has Pluto right there. And so America's in the forefront. Now, if we look at themes for the different decans of Capricorn, the first decan, which is the first 10 degrees, well, if we look at historical images and themes, that seems to have a lot to do with the actual ground or space or land, and you'll see it. You'll see it being good for treasure and or the quality of the the metals in a mine. Whereas the third decan of Capricorn, one of the persistent images is a dude with a big bag of money sitting behind a desk, right? It's which I abbreviated in 36 Faces to the throne, right? It's the big desk of power, right? That might be the president, a president sitting behind that desk. It might be a powerful banker, but it's that management layer. It's that top part of the management layer of an area, and it's in the same sign as the first decan, right? So what is the person behind the desk managing, right? Well, where does the gold that's extracted from the land go to, right? But it's not the same. It's not the same location exactly. Right. And so, just to use, again, the simplification I used in Faces, like it's the throne. Where is the Saturn-Pluto conjunction happening? It's the throne, right? It's the top level of leadership. And all over the world, that is super fucking obvious, right? That's where Pluto is. Saturn's going to join there.
Yeah, I like
Does
it.
that make sense?
That's good. That's real good. It also, so it's relevant when it's relevant, and it's an invitation, just in general, it's an invitation to look at that extra layer for either nuance or kind of like refracted meaning. It's good. I hope that answers your question, Thomas. Like this one, I'll take point on.
Yeah.
Would you say that cryptocurrency will be tied to the Uranus Taurus transit since currency was brought up? I would. So
Yes.
yes is one answer. I think cryptocurrency is actually tied more to the triplicities, given that the preview of it from the sort of early 80s was when we essentially financialized the economy. So that was the beginning of things like derivatives and the process of bundling up mortgages that expanded off nothing that existed, nothing that tied to the physical. It was the same amount of mortgages or houses, but suddenly it had, because of that base layer, a 100 to 1,000x times the amount of money. So the permanent breaking of a coin or whatever as a store of value, and it becoming an indicator of value, I think is a triplicity thing. Now Uranus and Taurus, for me, because this is really good questions because, again, I've been working on the Wealth Magic course for next year. Uranus in Taurus is that changing state and value of physical things. And it's literally a bull, which is cows were amongst the original currency. So, yes, that's. I'm just a bit concerned when people ask a question like that they're going to look at Uranus and Taurus and cryptocurrency and say, well, that those two are identical, or I can invest in cryptocurrency based on Uranus and Taurus and things that are pinging it. It's the step down from that, and it is the story of how we change and dissociate the value of the physical and the non-physical, and that's the story that gives us cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency doesn't cause that, so I would just kind of reverse or drop it down to another level. But what do you think?
I think that's really good, Gordon. Well, and that's, and I would say that that's good astrology. We're like, okay, this is relevant in terms of this macro cycle. And then this is of the many micros that are running inside the macro. It's the relatively micro is the Uranus and Taurus,
Yeah.
but it's in the context of that triplicity shift. And so one thing I will say is that I will be really surprised if we don't see some of the sort of the most dramatic developments in the crypto story in 2022. And the reason why is that we'll have our 2022, Saturn's been in Aquarius for a little bit. It's been doing squares with Uranus and Taurus. But in 2022, our eclipse cycle shifts so that we have North Node, Rahu, Dragon's Head eclipses on top of Uranus and Taurus. And so we basically, the eclipses will be hitting that Uranus and Taurus button while Saturn is configured to it. And that just seems like that'll be the most exciting part of that particular roller coaster.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Speaking of roller coasters, so we have this is another kind of like good macro implication one. Mars grinding against Saturn, will one dominate, or is that chart specific depending on which is the better, quote unquote, if you're watching this at home or listening to the audio malefic? So go for it.
Okay, so generally speaking, that's positional. When they're in Capricorn, they will actually they will probably end up working together relatively well to do Mars Saturn things, right? When they're in Aquarius, Saturn is in a vastly stronger position. Saturn's in its own rulership. It's in its home. Mars is pretty kind of homeless in Aquarius, meaning that like it doesn't have a lot of the surroundings in Aquarius don't empower Mars at all. They're not specifically disempowering, but there's there's just not as much to work with, and so Mars will be looking to Saturn, to lead the parade, or angry at Saturn because it's not providing for Mars. So during the Cap phase, maximal chance of working together. During the Aquarius phase, Saturn is in the superior position. Mars is either going to be led by that or resent that. And then second half of the year when Mars is in Aries and Saturn is in Capricorn. So there's a sign-based square between the two, and there's an old Hellenistic rule for sort of understanding who has the upper hand in a square, because a square which is 90-degree angle is a contestive relationship, and so when you have a contest, you want to then know who has the upper hand. Right, you can make a lot of money if you know who in contests will win. Right, betting on boxing, and so the planet which would rise earlier in the day is considered to be on the superior side of that square and will tend to have the upper hand. So that's going to be Saturn in the superior side, but Mars, it doesn't mean that Mars won't provide serious resistance to the degree that they're disagreeing. And a good example of the superior square, like being having the upper hand, was during and this is sort of where I tried this out, applying this to larger configurations, was during the Uranus-Pluto squares, which were it was Pluto in Capricorn and Uranus in Aries, which basically ran 2011 to 2016. And so Uranus-Pluto squares, the astrologers, by the way, as a community nailed that one, but nobody was paying attention. We were all like, we were all expecting revolt, like widespread revolt and chaos. And literally, just as it clicked in, we got the Arab Spring and movements everywhere, blah, blah, blah. Not blah, blah, blah. Some of that was really good stuff. Some of it was really destructive. But I remember looking at this and saying like, oh, Pluto in Capricorn, which is the control side, is in the superior position to Uranus and Aries, which is the revolt side. I was like, I think that control is going to win when all is said and done. And so if we look at that 5 or 6 years, and then we look at the result, the world that resulted was way more locked down. The various, the people who were in control became very aware of the threats to their power and doubled down on the security, unfortunately, in a pretty effective manner. And so that's an example of Pluto was in the superior position that time. The opposite will happen, but not right now. Does that make sense?
It's good. It's really good. I'm obviously glad you went first on that one, and I have nothing to add. Next question is from Christine. I like this one. The practice of coordinated Hellenistic astrology and accumulation of data. How do you guys see the evolution of astrology's truth status in the culture? And I'll go, well, Christine, we are here. This at the triplicity handover is as far as I'm concerned, the dominant of witchcraft or wider inclusions. I think it seeps in. I think it permanently seeps in, at least for the extent of this dominant, right? So the only way is up, but I view it as kind of like more philosophical and interesting, and dare I say structural cultural truthiness. At the moment, it is a frothy bubble of. It's having a moment in the sun, the same way witchcraft did, or at least the white girl version of it in 2016 with the election of Trump. It's having a moment in the sun now, but I think it embeds itself permanently in the structure of cultural truth from here on out for sure. As I said, I'm bullish on it, not just because it works, but I think that's what the dominant looks like. Anyway, your thoughts, Austin?
Okay, so I have a somewhat complicated relationship to that question, because ever since I've been aware of anybody else doing astrology, people have been nurturing this dream of like, oh my God, what if we gained cultural credibility? What if we were in the university departments? And that dream is at least 51% detrimental to astrology and focusing on good practice of it. It's sort of like if you're trying to get good at anything, you're trying to nurture any art, and you're busy thinking about what people who don't understand it might say if they saw you doing it, your ability to get good and your ability to caretake the art itself will be diminished by the attention you're spending thinking about what Instagram thinks about it. So I've just seen that for years, and I've also seen people tempted to distort the nature of astrology and the way it works so that it sounds better. And so I'm very protective of astrology, as far as the way I I'm protective of it. I think it's an amazing thing, and I probably don't need to be protective. It's made it through God knows how many thousand years and how many other hostile paradigms. It's a incredibly resilient thing, but I love it, so I have feelings of protection that are natural.
Sure.
That said, I think that Gordon is probably right in that I think astrology is just going to do better the next 2 centuries than it did in the last 2 centuries.
Yeah.
I think that the baseline level of acceptance is going to be higher than we've seen in several generations, and that doesn't mean astrology conquers everything, but it does mean that based on what we're used to, way better.
I think if some examples over the next, bearing in mind 200 years, are it will be normalized to elect for weddings or get astrological consult if you're looking at buying property, in the same way it is across 2/3 of the world's population. That's like not unusual behavior. So I think it normalizes the way acupuncture or something does, where it becomes structural in culture, and people don't look at you like, "Ooh, you elected your wedding, fancy." It's just like a thing. It's as normal as going to pick out flowers. And I think that happens. I also think it happens at the moment. It's used at a kind of billionaire level, right? But I actually think you will see it not determine wholly corporate strategy, but I don't think it will be weird when you're on your strategy away days, if you work in the corporate environment and you're talking about the goals or the KPIs for next year. I don't think it's weird anymore, and I think it'll normalize to some extent to look at to have a chart for your company and the people in charge of it, and actually look at what's going on, because there's, as we know, there's insight in there, and I see that happening. I think it becomes the froth goes away, and it normalizes in the same way that getting a housing report or inspection done on a property before you buy it does. And we may well be dead for most of that, but I'm bullish, and I think that will happen.
Yeah, I would say that that happens within the next 20 years. I don't think it happens in the next 5.
Yes, that's
where it's not every company has that, but like with some companies, like with like a not with a considerable number, like they bring in the corporate astrologer who does exactly this kind of thing and specializes in it to be like, well, this is what this looks like.
Yeah.
And I know of that happening already. And again, you mentioned like, this is not a weird thing in other parts of the world. I think it might end up looking a little bit more like it does in India, which isn't, where astrology is much more widespread, but it's not like everybody does that. And some people fucking hate it. And some people are like, no, some people won't make a move without it. But it's just like, it's a thing that's around that people relate to in the variety of ways that people relate to it. Just like, if we look at how astrology is, how it exists culturally during the Roman Empire, right? Cicero fucking hates all these astrologers. All the senators are talking to astrologers, and it drives him nuts. But it's around, and I think that's astrology's normal place to be amazing to 10% of the population, to be hated by 10%, to have everybody in between. That it's just around.
Cool. From Jasmine, can we talk about how to navigate ancestor work with a family that doesn't agree with these sorts of spiritual practices? What are the ethics and implications? Well, I have an entire course that I'm actually quite proud of from the beginning of the year on spiritualism and ancestor work. One of the things we looked at in the course was, if you are drawn to this stuff, you are probably the person in the family that your ancestors are calling to do this essential work, because the living relatives are only one hand of the equation. It is a requirement of the living to tend the dead. So what your family thinks of it, if you're really drawn to it, there is no ethical implication. Your ethical obligations after taking millennia off is to get right with your ancestors. So I don't think there's... Now, if you are cohabiting with your family, that's not that it's different, that just changes the tactics. it doesn't change the ethics. So that would be me on it. I deem it an essential and universal magical requirement or behavior, sort of like the base of a food pyramid. But anyway, you'll go, Austin.
Yeah, I agree with that. You know, I don't really think I don't think your family gets to how should we say attack you on moral grounds if you leave a glass of scotch out for grandma once a month. You know, like that's your business how you relate to to your dead.
Yeah.
And you know, it'll probably benefit them, but I do think that when you're doing that kind of work that you do have to, or I don't know if you have to, but it's much easier and much more useful to let go of the living members of your family understanding and appreciating what you're doing. You know, I like you were saying, Gordon. You know, the ancestors have gone untended for a lot of us for a while. And so, you know, like that work kind of needs to get done,
Yeah.
and it needs to get done because it hasn't gotten done. Not
Yep.
you know what I mean? Like if your family totally understood it and was like, yeah, that's great, that you probably then there probably aren't the same level of problems
Yeah,
to
yeah, yeah. There's
solve,
there's less work
if
to
that makes
do.
sense.
There's absolutely less work to do if they're not if they're open to it. You're doing good already. I agree completely. I don't know, and I mean I write about this in Chaos Protocols as well. But the best luck magic you can do, and maybe this is really important to mention for 2020, maybe in an extended Capricorn season with the god of death. Um, we rely on the dead for luck, and getting right with your ancestors and keeping that practice is honestly just the best luck magic. Your life runs smoother, as does your family's life, if you do that correctly. So I don't see any get out at all. I don't care what religious background your family is. I don't see how you can do magic without it. I don't see. Yeah. Anyway, but I'm fairly militant about it, I guess.
Yeah.
Alrighty.
And that's part of the, you know, what we were talking about earlier.
No, go on.
It just if you're, you know, like if like chances are there aren't, you know, you're not part of a legion of people who have the same skills and understandings. Like,
Yeah.
you know, and that's part of the like being, you know, stepping up and doing the heroic thing, which a lot of times means not being seen heroic. Is like you do it anyway because it needs to be done,
Yeah.
right? Nobody else is gonna, you know, help fucking great great grandpa with his alcoholism, right? Which is still like filtering down into the family. Like I have, you know, I happen to have been turned on to, you know, this ancestral stuff, and there are good methods, and I've gotten pings personally. It's like it's on, you know, it's on you.
Yeah.
Um, like that's part of doing it.
Agreed. This is from Tenzin. Do you agree with the sentiment of other astrologers that both new moons and full moons are afflicted and therefore care should be taken when working with the moon at those times?
Well, those are different things. I do not agree that the moon is afflicted on a full moon. The lunar current is, you know, it can be a little out of control. You know, it's high tide, and so that will be contra certain operations and pro for other operations. Now, during the new moon, you can't see the moon. We're using the contemporary definition of a new moon, when the sun and moon are conjunct, the dark moon. In a lot of older material, when they say new moon, I mean the first glimmer of light you see after the period of invisibility. That's a different thing. But the period centered around the conjunction of the sun and moon is a time for, so the moon has no light. The moon's light is possesses the power to bring things into manifestation, and so you don't want to try to bring things into manifestation when the visible power that represents that is at zero. That doesn't mean that new moons are useless. They're great things to do during new moons. They are not surging into manifestation. In natal charts, moons that have the moon very close to the sun, there will be difficulties in the house that the moon rules that are often quite visible. If we're saying, the moon is technically much more afflicted in, let's say, especially like the final 6 degrees, where it's closing in on the sun, there will often be natal difficulties as a result of that. And as a timing piece, that is a time period for letting go, for purification, for emptying the cup, meditative practices, burning things up, not for starting up a new thing, ideally.
Yeah.
But even that, like, the more the more angles there are on everything.
Correct.
There are. Speaking of like the Cunning Man's Handbook, there's a little recipe for an operation in there to like hide something, or to basically to create invisibility, or to hide something in such a way that no one will ever find it, and it requires a dark moon, right? Because that's what you want. You want no light at night, right, for perfect invisibility. But and so you just, I would say, each of these things, each of these phases has a character, and if you interface directly with what is that, what is happening, what is the quality of this piece of time that repeats, and then if you're focused on that, and then hear opinions from living and dead practitioners, you'll understand why they said that about this phase, rather than just like all bad or all good. It's like, no, it's this, and that means that no, it's terrible for that. But you can, if you want to be sneaky, then that's perfect. Or new moon, dark moon is good for dealing with the dead. They're much easier. They're much easier to find when there's no light. Of the night. Anyway.
No, it's excellent. And I would just add, because that was extremely robust, is when you write, care should be taken when working with the moon at these times. Care should always be taken with any configuration. If you're electing anything, care should be taken. It's the same with any other kind of magic. Like, it can, not that it's not care should be taken in the sense of handling radioactive material, with some notable exceptions, but particularly with astrological magic, be precise or it won't work. So yes, care should be taken with new moon and full moon or whatever, but it should be with, it always should be, like, it's a game of precision. It's not that would just be kind of like, what everything you said about the moon was amazing, and maybe just put it in the subset of like, you should always be taking care if you're going to be messing about with this stuff, because it's real. What do you want?
Yeah, well, and with the astrological magic, like, kind of the do it right or won't work. Unfortunately, that is not the case. It actually, if you do most of it right, it'll work, and it'll work against you, or it'll work sideways.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever had an operation end up inert, but I've definitely had things be like, do what I wanted, but with a weird serving of something else that I didn't want on the side. But yeah, it just, I would say, know your operation, and then know what it needs from astrology, right? So if we're looking at like hygromantia, spirit conjuration stuff, it tells you. It's like these days of the moon will work. These are the good ones. The other ones, not so much. So you don't need to know, it doesn't tell you you need to know exactly what degree of the zodiac Uranus is at, because
Yep.
that's not relevant. But
Particularly for spirit world.
but it does ask that,
Yeah.
right, it asks that you consider time of day and phase of the moon. So do that,
Yeah.
right? If you
And
pick a trick stuff, well, now everything matters.
yeah, and to contextualize that, that is what historic data accumulation looks like, because we data and statistics and all that is actually only sort of like post Pascal, a few centuries old as we understand it. And so when you look at, and this was one of the things that chaos magic got wrong in the 80s, was, oh, this is all just silly nonsense, I'm just going to give it a go. It isn't. It's in there for a reason. They just didn't show working. So start with fidelity to the timing, and go from there. Because if it's what you see when it's like you shouldn't do this on this time or that time, don't try and look for the logic on it. It's not in the text. The text owes you nothing. These manuals owe you nothing. They are historic artifacts from practitioners. They're not a 101. They don't. It's not like a Q&A like this. They owe you nothing. And so stick to have a bit of respect for it and yourself, and stick to the timing, and work from there. So I think that's what I mean by care should be taken with all elections. And someone I'm watching the comments. The notable exceptions I was referring to are actually this. In the Key of Solomon, you have very specific phase and sign of the moon for doing different, like calling up spirits to go to war or to kill someone or whatever. And that's what I mean by sometimes the elections are radioactive. Cool.
Yeah, and I would also just say, in general, the more important, the more crucial it is that the magic do exactly what you want. The pickier you have to be about everything. And if you're handling more radioactive material, or you're handling a radioactive situation, if you're handling radioactive material, you just need to be more thoughtful about everything. And the hotter the magic is, the more cooling sleeves and cooling elements you need to make sure that it doesn't melt down.
Yeah.
And don't do that. That's just like hot magic can burn you in a way that more temperate magic cannot.
Absolutely. All right, lucky last question, and this is from, according to the document that Caitlin has been putting together as we go, from many people. Austin, when is the second edition of 36 Faces coming out?
So I was hoping to get it out by Christmas. Definitely not happening. We're taking our time on the illustrations. Text is almost ready to go. I think that when you see the illustrations, you will be glad that you waited. Right now, my timing with the artist for all the illustrations done is end of February. I'm going to see if I can somehow motivate quicker. But we're basically looking at the end of Q1.
Cool.
And I'm super excited.
Yeah, me too.
It's kind of nice to have a little. I thought I was going to just rush and get it done at the very end of the year, and I'm really glad that I've got a little bit more time to just dot all of the I's, cross all of the T's. I think it's going to be, and it's not just a reprint, right? All new illustrations. There'll be some additional sections that I'm adding. The text will be, we'll go through a couple layers of typo cleaning. I wrote that like 2012, 2013, and so I've learned some things since then. So I'll have the time to, to add all those embroideries.
Well, we're all looking forward to it. And we have done, after all those technical difficulties, we've done a very good job. Bit of a marathon show. What have we got? 2 hours, 40 something minutes. That's not bad. So, I'm pretty sure people know by now where to find you and what have you. But what have you got coming up? Where can people find you and so on? Let's lay it on them.
Okay, I'm Austin Coppock. I'm at austincoppock.com. AUSTINCOPPOCK. So next year, a lot of what I'm going to be doing is teaching classes. I've got a year one program, which is either going to start March or April, and I also have a year two program, March or April, mostly for people who've gone through year one. I am open to people who meet the requirements jumping in. I might teach a year three. I might wait a year on that. We'll
Oh,
see.
very cool.
I'm going to actually open up readings again for the first time in
Ah,
almost a year. Um, um, Within the next couple weeks. That'll go out first to people on my mailing list and then out to the public. So if you want to make sure you get a spot, you should sign up for the mailing list. And I also I am the consulting astrologer, and I do all the elections for Sphere and Sundry, which puts out amazing astromagic materia and talismans. Find that at sphereandsundry.com. And I've got various things. I'm going to be at NORWAC, the NORWAC conference in May, speaking on 3 different things. I will be at the ISAR conference in Denver in early September, speaking about a bunch of things. I did a long on the 2020 theme. I did a long discussion analysis of the Astro of 2020 with Chris Brennan and Kelly Surtees. That should be out before too long on the Astrology podcast. People might want to check that out if they'd like the Astro heavy version. And yeah, I don't know. I'll probably do some other things as well.
yeah.
But I'm at austincoppock.com. I'm on Facebook and Twitter, and I'm on Instagram, but I've literally posted like 6 times ever, so it's not the best way to get a hold of me.
You're getting better at Twitter too. You'll answer some DMs. That's pretty good.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to work out how to switch this off. This has been amazing as ever. I hope, and thanks everyone for showing up live and for the really good questions and all the rest of it. I've been watching them tick up. It looks like you guys have had a lively time, and you can probably watch along on the replay if that's what you're doing. But all right, guys, thanks very much, and yeah, we'll do this again.